Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, March 10th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. I am just getting over COVID, so I'm a little bit sniffly. I apologize if you can hear it in my voice. That is why, but I'm feeling much, much better. I'm finally testing negative. I have emerged into the world again after many, many days of being trapped inside of my house, so I am appreciative of that. I'm appreciative that I've gotten better, and I'm appreciative that my infection was not too bad due to the wonder of vaccines. Thank you, science. Before we get into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download, and we keep it going due to the support from individuals just like you. If you would like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. I highly recommend using the browser-based version of the website instead of subscribing through an app on your phone. I'm not going to say who, but one of the big phone manufacturers who has their own app store has decided to take a whopping cut every time you do that. So you can get around that by just subscribing through the website version. All right, this week's top patrons include Anu Bhadavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so very much. All right, let's get into it. So this week I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Lauren E. Oakes. She's a conservation scientist and, of course, a science writer. She's held various appointments at Stanford University over many, many years as a researcher, a lecturer, and an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Earth System Science. Her previous book was called In Search of the Canary Tree, and she has a new book out called Treekeepers, The Race for a Forested Future. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Lauren E. Oakes. Well, Lauren, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So I am really excited to talk about your new book, Treekeepers, The Race for a Forested Future. But as always on Talk Nerdy, before we dive into the content of this book and some of the kind of, debunking some mythology and things like that, I would love to learn a little bit more about you and how you came to write this book. So, reading different bios of you on the internet, sometimes you're sort of referred to as a conservation scientist, sometimes you're referred to as an ecologist. Like, what did you study in school?
What are you?
Yeah.
Yeah, the language kind of morphs, but my training, I was in the interdisciplinary environmental science program at Stanford. I received my PhD there.
Well, that makes sense then. It was interdisciplinary, so of course.
Yeah, but we did have what they call fields of depth. So mine were ecology and land change science, mainly in forest ecology, looking at how forests are impacted by climate change, how forests respond, and species that regenerate in the wake of forest mortality. I can tell you a little bit about that. And then I have also done a lot of research in land change science. So looking at land use, land change, drivers of land use and land change, that's really thinking about the relationship between people and how our land ecosystems are managed.
Oh, interesting. I don't think I've ever heard that label before, land change science. And so is it historical? Is it future oriented? Or do you kind of look at both, what has happened in the past to inform how to make decisions about the future?
Well, land change scientists, again, draw from a number of disciplines, but are really looking at the drivers of land use change, and they may be focusing on biophysical changes. So a land change scientist could be a geographer who's working a lot with remotely sensed data to look at, okay, here's point A or time period A, and this was what the landscape looked like. And here's time period B, and now it's forest was cleared, or there's a new development here, or something has changed in this landscape. And then usually there's a level of research to look at, what happened in that place, whether it's social science to assess, what was happening in the communities, or policy. Maybe there's a larger policy in the area that's helping drive some land use change. But yeah, it's an interdisciplinary field and, has been around for a number of years.
Yeah, and obviously that training and that interest area heavily informs your writing, and especially this book that we're going to focus on a little bit more. Not that we have to, focus on it the whole interview, but I'm curious, just so that we have like operational definitions early on, and this is my ignorance here, as a land change scientist, when you talk about, transformation of the landscape. Do you make a differentiation between like intentional impacts and unintentional impacts?
Yeah, my focus has largely been in forest ecosystems, as you know, but our species relationships are constantly evolving and forests are always changing. So there are, changes in flux that may be naturally occurring, but then there are the drivers, of our human footprint. And in, recent years, this age of Anthropocene, those changes may be attributed to climate change, or they may be attributed to direct land conversion when you get a development in an area or a clearing of a forest. A lot of people in my lab group when I was at Stanford were focusing on kind of the hot spots of deforestation, looking at a lot of forest degradation in the Amazon, in Congo, trying to figure out what are effective ways to manage those lands better. And so you opened with the question of, am I a conservation scientist? And really a conservation scientist has the goal of, sustaining a functioning natural world. And so, yes, I would say, I am a conservation scientist as well. My interest is, as a researcher and really more as a practitioner. I've worked a lot with local organizations that are experiencing changes in their area as a result of climate change or as a result of development. And they're thinking about, how do we manage these systems better?
Yeah, and that word management, I think, is important for maybe folks who are listening to this conversation who haven't thought about what we're about to dive into as deeply. Like, I'm going to have a lot of very naive questions here because even though it's something that I have thought about and I have interviewed people about and I have worked with individuals on topics in these areas, it's not an area where I have even a modicum of expertise. And I'm curious, just to kind of push maybe not the point, but the question a little deeper. One thing that I'm always fascinated by is how we label things, how we categorize things, sort of the constructs that feel relevant to us. And we often think, because it is the Anthropocene, right? Everything we do has a consequence. And it's a large consequence because human beings are massive drivers of change on this planet. But at the same time, there is often a management component to the work that we do and intentionality. If we choose to do this, we're hoping that these things will follow versus, oh, I'm just doing what I do and oops, oops, look what happened as a result of that. And so I'm curious, do sort of land management scientists or even with you in your writing, do you make firm distinctions between those things or is that a very fuzzy line?
Between the intention, it sounds like the intentionality, you know.
Yeah.
I would
Yeah,
say
like, I'm doing this and I'm doing it on purpose.
mhm. I would say in most cases, in the breadth of projects I've worked on now in, you know, well, three continents, really, a lot in Latin America, North America. I've spent some time in Indonesia. There is an external driver of change, be that climate change, be that a company coming in and deciding, purchasing land that they want to convert for ag purposes. Those are just a couple examples. And then the local community or the local people there are impacted in some way and want something different. There's an intention from, the outside developer, but that may be a different intention than what a community wants or needs, in response. But I also think more and more, and we can talk about it as we get into, tree keeping and tree keepers,
Mm,
we need those parties coming together and parties are coming together to think about, how do we use land in productive ways while also keeping trees and how do we make the tree keeping, financially viable. And then it's not, then it's like a collective intention. Everybody's after the same goal.
right, right, and that's probably where a lot of the difficulties come in is when there are multiple sort of parties involved, and sometimes those parties aren't even people, right? They're the people who are speaking for, shall we say, the animals or the other forms of the local ecology. So there are multiple parties involved, and sometimes their goals are not aligned, and sometimes they're in direct kind of opposition to one another.
Hmm.
And that's probably where things start to get a bit complicated.
Definitely.
Yeah. And so I'm going to put a final kind of button on this point before we get into the specifics of tree keepers and of trees especially. I was asking about these sort of intentional consequences versus these unintentional consequences, but very often because the globe is a closed system, I don't even know how to put words into this, probably because it's early, probably because I have like COVID brain fog right now. But like you mentioned how like climate change is always going to have an impact, right, on a local ecological system. And then maybe, okay, an intentional forest clear. Let's say somebody's like mining for gold and they're clearing a portion of the forest. We see this all the time in the Amazon. And then obviously there are going to be intentional consequences of that. But ultimately, that very clearing of that forest for the gold mining is also contributing to climate change, which is then
Yeah,
driving another layer of impact, right? So a lot of times these things end up kind of building on themselves, don't they?
for sure. And in land change scientists and people are doing this research, we talk a lot about feedbacks. So, it's just a constant cycle of what we are doing as people to the environment, how the environment then responds, as well as, these external forces beyond, which may be climate change and others.
Very often, when I speak with science writers on the show, which I would say make up a pretty large component of the individuals that I interview on Talk Nerdy, are scientists/science writers, or some kind of combination of the two. I'm I'm always curious how you decided to kind of focus on this specific project. For many people, it's a culmination of like years of their research interests. Yes, okay, but I guess I'm curious. A big question, which is, what were you hoping when you sat down to say, okay, I'm going to work on this book? What kind of questions were you trying to answer, or stories were you trying to tell? And then by the end of it, did you end up where you started, or did it become a totally different project than you intended?
Oh my gosh, starting with all the big questions. Okay,
Right.
good. We should get back to why write. It's like an interesting mix too when you're a scientist and a writer. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
I think at the big picture, I love storytelling. I feel like there's a lot of research and positive action out there that doesn't get media coverage, and I really enjoy the process of taking what I consider to be problem solving research, or people doing really innovative things in communities to help the environment and therefore help themselves, and telling about that work. So I'd say my career has been kind of a mix of going back and forth between them, doing research, applied research, working with communities on land use changes that they're experiencing. How do we manage those systems better? And then also the writing part. So I kind of go in and out, and I obviously just spent a couple years with my head down. But what did I go into hoping? Well, I'll tell you a little bit of the origins, how I got interested in
Yes, please.
Treekeepers.
Yeah. Yeah. That was
I
kind
touched
of what I was asking in the least direct way possible.
I touched upon, forest mortality. So my PhD focused on a tree species, yellow cedar, Calotropis nucitensis. It's a magnificent species in the Pacific Northwest, and in parts of Alaska. It's dying because of climate change. And I was looking at how those forest communities, how the other species in that ecosystem respond after the death of this tree, and also thinking about and researching, doing a lot of social science research, interviewing people in communities. How are they responding to the loss of this tree? Are they managing their forests any differently? How are they impacted, and how are their lives affected? It sounds like a pretty depressing topic, but I actually found it quite hopeful, which is actually why so my first book was called In Search of the Canary Tree and came out of this research. And I had gone to Alaska at the time to do this work because I thought of it as like the front lines of climate change. Rewind to 2009 to 2010, 2011 when I was doing this research. We weren't experiencing the amount of wildfires and other impacts that we're experiencing in the West now, but they were certainly predicted. And warming in the northern latitudes were twice, if not three times, the global averages. So from my philosophical and scientific perspective, Alaska and the northern latitudes are kind of a looking glass into the future. But coming out of that research, both the work that I was doing for my PhD and writing In Search of the Canary Tree, I had been thinking so much about loss, and also seeing communities come together to adapt, seeing species respond in positive ways, other species seeing a changing but flourishing forest. I was thinking about regrowth, and where are there places in the world where that have experienced a real decline in forest cover, but then something turned around. Now they're increasing. This was 2018, 2019. there were countries on my radar at the time known for what's called a forest transition, going from loss to forest gain. Bhutan, Chile, Costa Rica, Vietnam. Those were a few that had my attention. But then I was also thinking about, well, could this happen at a global scale? Like here, as both a scientist studying land use change, well-read person reading about our environmental narratives, really reading our environmental narratives across the world is a story of loss. But I wanted the optimistic story of, could we turn it around? What would turn it around? Around that same time in 2019, a study came out in the journal Science. It was led by a scientist at ETH Zurich named, he was the senior author, Tom Crowther, and another scientist, Jean-Francois Bastam, who was the lead. And they were looking at what was called the global tree restoration potential. And they were essentially looking at how much more forest could the world support. And they came up with about 1 trillion trees. It was 1.2. And then what they also did was estimated the amount of carbon those trees could store. It hit the media big. I mean, everyone who's a scientist would love to get in Science, the journal Science, and not all those studies, get a lot of media. And this one had about, 700 media articles published soon after.
So it was kind of like, plant all these trees and we'll save our planet.
Yeah, and part of it was Tom Crowther has since said, I made a mistake in the communications. Like I didn't really think that if I just, if I said planting, everyone would think, if I said restoration, everyone would only think planting. In truth, the work of 1.2 trillion trees or 1 trillion trees is about tree keeping. And the places that we have trees now is about growing the forests out that aren't mature yet. And yes, about, planting, but planting is only a part of that. And it also took off because it seemed, well, first of all, not everybody, but mostly everybody really likes trees. I feel like we have a long affinity for trees being in and around them. It's not necessarily a controversial issue. And so you had, oil and gas companies and like Total standing up saying, here's the commitment we're going to make to forests, to trees. The problem, and where it became a bit dangerous, as some scientists said or quoted, was that some people thought it would alleviate the need to reduce fossil fuels. And that is not true. Like the first and foremost thing we need to do if you're addressing climate change is reduce our fossil fuel consumption. And then, yes, trees, have a role to play for carbon sequestration. But of course, there are other gases that are also contributing. So as we dig deeper, you can see it's quite complicated. But I wanted to, basically, there were a lot of media headlines around that time. You can still do it if you Google like tree planting and climate, and you'll see headlines, saying this is an incredible climate solution, and some saying it won't work. Tree plantings failed. And, they're all 700 to 1,500 word articles. I wanted to take a deep dive into the complexities and into the topic of, to really what extent can trees save us and how. And that was the motivation for this project. So I was interested in the answer to that question, but I was also really interested in the journey. Like, what would I learn along the way by trying to answer that?
Yeah, and I think that's obviously, I mean, you know it better than most. That's so important when we're talking about good quality science writing, is we have to have that journey. We have to hear that story, because without the story, what we're hearing are a bunch of facts and figures, and it's very easy to sort of
so overwhelming, yeah,
forget them, or we get overwhelmed by them. We forget
or you just
them.
forget them. You
they lose
gloss over.
context. Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh wait, more or less, I can't remember, right? But once we anchor it into narrative, it starts to become meaningful to us. And so I guess like that is the big question here, right? Is it's not so simple as we often think it is when we are scrolling and we just read a media headline. It's not just plant more trees and everything's going to be fine, or, maintain the forest that we already have and everything's going to be fine, because it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, and everybody likes black and white. As Tom Crowther said to me at one point, like there were all these sexy headlines, plant trees, don't plant trees. Like, how do you make a sexy headline out of the gray between? It's difficult. I guess I made a book instead.
And it's interesting that you chose to title, and I know that we don't always, the titles of our books are not always our first choice. They're not always our choice, but it's interesting that ultimately, let's say we landed on this title, which does seem to emphasize the keeping of the trees over the planting of the trees.
Yes, and that it points to both the need to keep the forests that we have currently standing, and also, to invest in and figure out how to keep the ones we're planting. It's an active long-term stewardship. If you want to get the benefits that a tree can provide, and I'm not just talking about carbon, we should chat about all the other benefits that trees provide, but that doesn't come in the initial act. Sure, there are some benefits that come short term, and also, evidence showing they have an effect on people engaged in the restorative work. There's an active healing or probably a positive effect on our mental state from doing that work, right, in the short term, or that day you spent tree planting. But really, if you want the benefits for those trees, you got to keep them into the future, and that is the great challenge. I did pick the title, but it took a long time.
Oh, good. Oh, nice. I love that. That's not always
and
the
then
case.
I think there was some like youth mystery novel or something that came out right before that had the name Treekeepers, and my heart just like sank to the floor. And I wrote them saying, they were
That's
like
okay. Different genre.
Okay,
different genre.
Different
part of the bookstore. Yeah. Different subheading. Yeah, for sure. So I think that obviously points to an important next question, which is, let's get into it, right? Let's talk a little bit about some of the benefits that trees confer, because I think, if you were to ask me straight up, I would say some of the things that you mentioned. Okay, sequester carbon, large scale, maybe respiration, right? Like, and in that, the sequestration of carbon, shade, like, I think about urban planning. So like it makes it literally colder underneath where the trees are than places that are just concrete. Like that's important. But like, what else? There's probably a bunch of stuff in the soil that the trees are like managing for. There's probably a lot that I don't know is going on with these trees.
For sure. And I think, there's some interesting studies coming out now, even looking at the effects of trees and, the percentage of tree cover or forest cover in proximity to agricultural lands, like or integrated with, that those trees can play a really critical role in restoring the soils underneath. So when you hear these arguments of, is it only ag or is it only forest? Actually the ag needs the forest. If we cleared all our forests and just tried to make farmland everywhere, like it's not going to work for a lot of reasons.
Why not mix them, right?
Right.
Why not have dual use kind of land?
Yeah. And there's, studies showing that in some places, in many places, you actually see an increase in productivity because of those restorative properties that the trees serve through their, root structures, through the communities, fungal and mycorrhizae they have underneath, and so on. But actually, I think, for me, you mentioned it a little bit, but the urban setting, as an ecologist who spent a lot of time in remote forests, researching this chapter on urban forestry was actually, one of the most eye-opening to me, because, these are the places where more people, on a per capita basis, come in contact with trees on a daily basis than these, remote, relatively pristine, intact forests that we've talked about. And so, they have an enormous cooling effect. There's some studies coming out of Portland showing neighborhood with or well-canopied neighborhood, as you might call it, compared to a neighborhood without as many trees or without a good tree cover, can be 20 degrees cooler in the summer.
Wow.
Now think about, the effects for the community members there. If you have elderly community members, economic effects if you're turning on fans or air conditioners to cool.
Yeah, kids playing outside, like just the health and wellness of the children. Yeah, it's huge.
There have been studies showing correlation, so not causation, but still correlation, some interesting findings on tree cover and test scores of kids in schools that have, more tree cover. One of the most seminal studies that kind of kicked off some of this research on how trees affect our psychology and mental processing were studies by a psychologist, Roger Ehrlich, in the 1980s. And he found that simply having a view of nature can accelerate healing and recovery time for hospital patients. And now there's, I talked with researchers, this was actually a really fascinating study, going out and trying to look at how the terpenes that you breathe in. So if you're in a forest, you can smell these, if you find yourself walking in a just a relatively intact forest, secondary, primary, there's a smell. I find does have a calming effect, and there are practices, what we call forest bathing, in other cultures. And now there's, Western science is trying to understand, like, does that smell or do those terpenes, those compounds that are in the air, have a calming effect on our brains? Anyways, we could talk for a long time about benefits, but
Yeah.
there are a lot of them. Also, in communities, in urban settings, there have been some studies showing that they are associated with reduced crime. You think about it as more people are out in the neighborhood. You want to go take a walk through that green space. There are more eyes out in the community than there would be without it.
And it is important that you mentioned too that like some correlation does not necessarily mean causation, because we do see this complicated interplay between socioeconomic status, between
Totally.
poverty and tree cover,
Hmm.
right? That in the poorest neighborhoods we see the most concrete, and in the most affluent neighborhoods we see the most tree cover. And so,
Exactly.
but that doesn't necessarily mean that working towards let's say in some cases it might be a dependent variable. Working towards changing the dependent variable may have a sort of feedback loop on the independent variable. Like, you never know.
Hmm. Yeah, the inequities are, really very much overlaid, and there's been some interesting work in the U.S. and in Europe to assess, our equitable or inequitable distribution of trees. So if you go to Seattle, where I spent some time, I think averages are around 23 or 24% tree cover. Wow, that sounds great. That's pretty good. There are some really magnificent shaded streets you can walk down with a beautiful canopy above you, but it's not that way everywhere. And there are certainly pockets with far less than that. And then you're right, they are overlaid with other challenges, and they tend to be in poorer areas.
All right, everyone. I want to take a quick break from today's episode to thank a brand new sponsor, Forever Framed. At Forever Framed, their journey began with a simple realization. In today's digital age, our phones are overflowing with precious and meaningful moments that are captured in photographs, but they remain digital, right? They're just trapped on your phone. Rarely do they see the light of day in physical form. Well, at Forever Framed, they create custom photo magnets that capture your pet's unique personality while giving back to the community. Every purchase supports a local animal rescue, so you're not just getting a keepsake, you're also making a difference. While pet parents are near and dear to their hearts at Forever Frame, their services extend to all individuals looking to cherish their most treasured memories, whether it's commemorating a family reunion, celebrating a wedding, or announcing a special date. I had one made of my little guy, Killer. It lives on my refrigerator. He oversees his realm, and I love it so, so much. But they really are chic. They're these little square tiles, so you can do them in packages of a single or a set of 9. They're really affordable and they look great. So go check them out right now at foreverframed.com. That's FUREVER framed.com. All right, everyone, let's get back to the show. And even here, like, I think about Los Angeles, where we're like such an interesting urban area because we're massive compared to how most urban areas are very like condensed into a small space. We're very sprawling, right? And very spread out here. And so you have every different type of neighborhood. And in Los Angeles, a lot of people do live in houses. We have a lot of apartment living as well, but kind of a higher than I think average for an urban area or a large urban center number of single family homes with land around them. And we have all these initiatives. And so obviously I'm jumping around a little bit, but I see all these initiatives here in LA from, our local museum to local nonprofit organizations, like just giving trees away, especially in lower income areas, saying like, here's some trees. Just, you want a tree? Here's a tree. You want to plant it in your yard? Take it for free. Take care of this tree. We want more trees out there. And we don't have the budget or the funding, or for whatever reason, from a municipal perspective, we're not always prioritizing city planning here, right? So like, you want to do it individually, you've got the option as well. And it makes me wonder, like, is it about an approach at all levels? Do we want it like to be kind of haphazard and also at a sort of city or state level planning?
Well, I love these questions,
Complicated question.
and no, but it felt important to and almost more tangible to look at them in the urban context, but then they parallel what you face in, more remote ecosystems. Is maybe someone comes in and gives you these trees or plants these trees from an outside, but again, how are they sustained into the future? In urban cities, or sorry, in urban areas, a lot of times you're getting funding, as you mentioned, through various mechanisms for that planting. And then the question of longer term maintenance, sometimes, yes, cities have those budgets, but a lot of times they don't. And so they'll come back, they'll look for a year or two to get established, but then the longer term maintenance of that tree falls on the adjacent landowner. So if you're a busy person in a community and you've got a lot of you're working 3 jobs, like who knows what all the what your situation is, but you know, unless you have the time and resources to care for that tree longer term, that's a challenge, and that adds a challenge. I loved what someone said to me in Tacoma, where I spent some time. It's one of the least treed cities in the Evergreen State. His question was, what if trees in cities were like street lamps? If you think of a street lamp as an essential, or a street light, sorry, a street light as well, both of them would be essential to
Right.
the urban community. They are stopping traffic. They are providing light in your community. And when they break, there's a budget and there's someone who's going to go out and fix them. What if we saw trees, the same way in our urban communities? Unfortunately, not everybody does, and we don't have the same funding mechanisms in place. So it is a bit haphazard in the sense of, the funding comes from lots of different sources.
Is that a function of just like pure ignorance? Do you think that there's an assumption that because it's, green and because it's natural and it's just going to take care of itself, like nature will just make it okay and we don't have to do any maintenance, we don't have to do any management?
No, I think it's just the reality of tree keeping in any context needs to be economically viable. I don't know. When I was in college, so I studied environmental studies at Brown. At that time, there was a paper presented. I can remember it. It was probably my sophomore year. Costanza was the author, and it was one of the first great evaluations of nature's services, ecosystem services. It was this idea of like, could we break nature into all these little components? And they did. And then say what services they provide to people and to our functioning, on Earth, and then put an economic value on it. And I remember thinking, well, this seems crazy to me. Don't people just want to protect nature? Like that was my, idealistic self at 20. Like it's wonderful. Like, why don't we all want it? Why can't we keep it all? But in reality, when you have economic pressures for land, people need a productive use. If your option is to clear the land and build A or B or, farm X or Y, the alternative to keeping those trees needs to have a financial incentive for people. And so while I thought at the time that was crazy, and also could we ever implement that? Now, 20 years later, countries are valuing their nature services as a means of building it into the economic system. And, we have all different mechanisms now for what we call payments for ecosystem services. Maybe you're paying someone to do something differently to their water to protect it. Maybe you're paying someone to keep those trees for the carbon they will sequester in the next 20, 30, 35, 50 years. So what I thought of was crazy, now I view as essential, because protecting nature or keeping a functioning natural world has largely been as external to our economic system. They're externalities. Those impacts are all externalities.
I think about some of the individuals that I've spoken with on the show before and in my personal life before who work in wildlife management, especially in some African countries. And the sort of awareness that I had when I visited some of these countries, that the rhetoric that we often hear in the West, which is that there's just these like big wild spaces. And don't get me wrong, they're stunning spaces and they feel very wild and they are very wild in many aspects. But the animals in these like large preserves in much of Africa are named, they're tagged, they are
Mm-hmm.
fully managed, right? They're watched. Like we know who these lions are, we know who these, elephants are. And there's decision making about culling and about relocation and about even something as scary to us in the West as an idea like trophy hunting is actually an intentionally managed effort in a lot of these places to protect the animals and to raise money. And a lot of people just don't recognize that. So that brings me to this kind of parallel question, which is that the rhetoric that you often hear about like rewilding, like, well, why don't we just kind of let it go back to itself, And it's like,
Hmm.
but what I'm hearing from you is this idea that like there has to always be active management. Now, sometimes that active management is more hands-on versus more hands-off, but you can't just walk away and say, okay, that area is going to take care of itself, because even if we're actively not doing anything there, our activities as a human species have affected
It's
it
affecting it.
in a
Yeah, there's
deep
no
way.
pristine. There's
Yeah,
nothing we can
yeah,
just, you know.
right.
I used to call it fortress conservation, where this idea that you could set up a national park or, you know, set line, put lines on the earth as this protected area, and it would stay stagnant and be forever. And that's certainly not true.
But everybody thinks it is. I
I
mean,
know it's
that's
true.
I feel like
It's true.
such a
Everybody
common
thinks it is.
misconception, right?
Even our ideas of, I think a lot of ideas of some of the most, again, intact forests like Congo and Amazon. Like if you think of, when we go to the heart of the Amazon and nobody's there. Well, actually, yes, there are people there, and there are indigenous people there, and they're living more harmoniously with nature than we do elsewhere. We people living elsewhere can certainly learn from communities that are managing their lands far more sustainably. Like our relationship is out of balance.
And they are managing them, right? Like these indigenous groups are still actively managing their land. Yeah, they're not just turning their backs.
I was also going to point to natural regeneration, that we've talked a lot about planting, talked a lot about doing, and the idea of active restoring and active management. But a lot of times in lands that have been, used for cattle grazing, for example, simply changing the land use, removing those cattle, no longer raising cattle on that land, can help recovery if there's a seed bed in that forest. So there's on those lands, if there's a seed bed from the forest that was there still in those lands or in adjacent lands. I visited a project in Panama. This was on the Azuero Peninsula. It was towards the end of my research and reporting. It was a really incredible effort bringing together local landowners and farmers. They had been cattle ranching in the area for a long time. The lands are degraded, the productivity has gone down, and also as a result of climate change, the dry season is much longer now. So when you think of all these cattle needing to eat their green grass, like they're not getting that because of the hot, dry season. The cattle that I saw in the region were, starving, really skinny cattle. Thinking about here, they're getting a lot of money for the meat. So people in that area wanted and needed to transition their land use to something else, and growing forests could help, restore biodiversity in the area, could help with ecotourism, could help sequester more carbon. And anyhow, this project had been carbon certified and is supported by Microsoft. But the point that I wanted to make was they were doing and still are doing a lot of planting. And, I didn't write about this at the time because they keep sending me updates on how things are going. And now they're also saying, just the act of getting all these landowners to stop the cattle farming is also helping the regeneration happen. Like the trees we planted are doing well. And then there's a whole nother generation that we didn't even expect because, they're coming back from the seedbed. So that is an act of, in some ways, letting the wild return, but facilitating it, through changing the land use, through some planting, yes, but largely through removal of those cattle that were, stamping down and grazing on the land all the time.
And that, of course, I think raises a complicated, a fascinating, an important question about the way that all of these systems in the most sort of stochastic way, like interact with one another. So, okay, removing the cattle grazing, and then you see all of these positive sort of consequences coming in. And yet at the same time, we don't need cattle for food, but we kind of need cattle for food. You know what I mean? Like we can make global decisions about meat consumption for, the health of the population. And we can affect change in a way that we can massively reduce, let's say, beef consumption and the amount of just like resources that raising beef requires. At the same time, I think about it kind of the way that I think about fossil fuels, right? We definitely need to stop utilizing fossil fuels the way that we do. But we also can't tomorrow turn off that faucet, or we would have like global economic collapse. And I think about a lot of these different systems in that way. We want to move towards something, and we want to do it way faster than we're doing it right now. But at the same time, there have to be economic alternatives, because people aren't going to stand for reforesting ag land if that's their only source of being able to feed themselves.
Explain that latter part a little more. People aren't going.
Well, that's the question, right? And that's why I think we have so much global pushback is in certain areas, there is this idea. I don't know if an idea is the right word, but there is a deep belief that the reason we're doing things the way we're doing them right now is because this is what we need, right? That we have X number of people on the planet. We have to feed them. We have X amount of arable land. How do we utilize this land? And it's interesting because I think what you're doing in this book is you're looking at that very data and you're saying, it's not so simple as let's just plant trees everywhere on the world and then we'll all be happy, right? But it's also not so simple as let's clear all the trees so that we can mine for gold and let the cattle graze and grow sugar beets and alfalfa. There's a balance here because there are still 8 billion people on the planet.
And I definitely point towards what I believe, and what others, I interviewed 150 people involved in restoration around the world, think is, most beneficial, which is we have colliding crises here, from the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis. There's even health problems that come from, more forest degradation. So they're all intersecting. I mean, the pressures are real and they will continue to be real. We need wood products. We've talked a lot about, food consumption, and certainly, yes, like, if we could change our behavior and not eat meat, that would protect a lot of forests and give a lot of people land to have forested places. But again, the communities living near those forests would then have the same question of how do they gain, what's the economic value they gain by keeping the trees? How do they build a sustainable system? And there's all kinds of, efforts to support those communities, they're called non-timber related project or products that come from forests. This can be beekeeping and bringing honey from the forest and making that into something. So I don't take a deep dive on there have been great books out there, many books written on the consumption side. And certainly, whether we're talking about fossil fuels or beef, reducing both of them at a global scale, if you could snap your fingers, like would solve all the problems,
Right.
But moving forward, I think of, and that's again, points to the title of the book. I think that tree keeping is something we can integrate into a lot of different land uses and are integrated into agricultural production in some places too. We also need to think about, and people are thinking about, how land use changes when it becomes unproductive for cattle or when it becomes unproductive for farming. Those communities are, in need of doing something different. And if there have been forests on those lands before and those lands could still support forests, why not have them there into the future? Why not help build them there into the future?
So then I guess that leads me, because you're right, like that's not the focus of your book, but one of the things that you do touch on, and I think it's an important conversation about that sort of extractive practice is, I guess, I don't know if I'm using the right words, but like timber, right? Logging,
Mm-hmm.
like literally cutting down trees to then be able to make things like houses and furniture and paper. And so I'm curious I guess maybe just like your ethical take on that. It's a complicated question, right? So similar to fossil fuels, yeah, the world would be great if we just never used fossil fuels. It'd be great if we didn't have to cut down trees to make houses, but we do. So is there a future where we don't, or is there a future where we do it in a more sustainable way? Like, what's your kind of takeaway after doing all this research?
Well, it was interesting to take a look back at some of the forest transitions that have happened historically. So, in parts of Europe, Scotland, for example, is one. There are other countries that in the last 100, 200, 300 years experienced forest transitions. And a lot of times they were, post-war, really, if you look at post-World War One or post-World War II policies where countries didn't want to rely on imports from other countries. And so they changed their forest policy domestically to say, okay, let's start planting forests. And those forests were, monoculture forests largely for wood product. So while you could say that story is a story of loss to gain, if you just say, oh, was there forest there before? And was the forest gone? And now there's a new forest. Yes. But when you start looking into what those forests are, were they native forests? Were they multiple species? Biodiverse? Are they now monocultures? There's a real question of what are we losing versus what are we gaining? So, I definitely make the point, and others certainly do from many interviews, that now when we think about restoration, in the ideal scenario, we're thinking about restoring ecosystems in a way that support a diversity of species, and that's not always possible, and that won't always be possible because we need timber. But I think that any project could start with that, that question: to what extent could we restore native species here? There have been probably 10 or 15 or 20 species most commonly planted in efforts around the world, for a long history. But there are some, 73,000 tree species known on Earth. So that was also some of the fascinating things to research as you start thinking about, okay, well, if we actually want to address two colliding crises here, a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis, we could do that, but only if we're planting and supporting, regeneration of biodiverse areas as well. That's really different than the timber question.
No, but it's an important one because they speak to each other, right? I think we often think in different levels, like micro, macro, meso. What we're talking about here are large efforts and super important efforts, like national, sometimes multinational efforts. But it can happen all the way down to the individual level as well, right? So I'm curious, we haven't talked too deeply about it, but we have kind of touched on policies or on decision making at these large sort of multinational levels. But what about like you and your home in, Bozeman, or me and my home here in Los Angeles? Are there things that I can be doing, whether it's from a voting or policy perspective, or whether it's from an individual sort of maintenance and management perspective of my own property to help improve biodiversity?
Yeah, I've recently wrote an article in Emergence magazine. It's a great magazine if you haven't come upon it. But I was actually researching post-fire regeneration. So what are some of these communities doing in LA and your area, it sounds like, that are recovering or just barely from fires? And there's a really incredible effort now among community members to collect wild seed and plant wild seed. People have been collecting in that area on their properties. So yes, thinking about a diversity of species that you can plant on your own property, if you are a gardener, if you have land, is certainly great. When I worked with the Climate Adaptation Fund for a while. It's what used to be one of the largest funders of adaptation efforts in the US. And some of the most interesting projects I found were pollination projects in cities where people were really clearly planting in their gardens, plants that would support pollinators and other species that were moving through those areas. Even if you're in a more rural area near farmland, doing that work is great, is helpful. Getting involved in your community to understand your forest cover is a really interesting way to engage with this topic. I have just started, locally. I've been working on this global book for many years, and I've just started getting more involved in my local community. And, there's a lot of complexities to managing what here in Bozeman is 27,000 urban trees. There are 4 people checking in on these trees. And yes, developments coming in, and yes, policies that could be changed and improved to help keep the forest cover here in this community. But I think any community could have that. And maybe you're sitting there in, Arizona. I mean, I live in the desert, but actually Phoenix, for example, was one of a great example of a city that went out there and has been doing some really interesting work and good work to increase their urban tree cover for cooling effects, and addressing tree inequities in that region as well, or in that city as well.
I have to ask, and in some ways, I feel like this might be a closing question. So before I dive into it, I do want to make sure that we've covered. From where I'm sitting, I feel like the important takeaway so far for me has been this is gray, right? This is a very complex question, and it's not so simple as let's just plant a bunch of trees wherever we can plant them and then walk away and hope that nature finds a way. But this is a situation that requires a lot of active management and a lot of important decision making for all of the different interested parties so that we can find sort of the most equitable and best possible solution giving all of these different pressures. Now, that said, you started this sort of conversation by saying, I was working on this project and I was writing about this topic and it sounded really depressing, right? And you were talking about your dissertation, but it sounded really depressing, but ultimately I found it really hopeful. And I'm curious if we can kind of bring that back to tree keepers. We're talking about these problems that feel sometimes insurmountable, but clearly you write with so much hope for the future. And so I'm wondering, A, where do you find that hope? And how do you implement it?
Well, first, I mean, I was just amazed at, I guess, the diversity of people that are tree keepers. I talked to so many people living in different settings and coming from different backgrounds, and you know trees captivated them in some way. I think that connection in some ways is innate. I write about that through the eyes of my son and watching him, and as his relationship to trees and nature has grown. um, but to me, so I find hope in that, and that was part of my effort in writing this book. Is I would like everyone, first, to enjoy the narrative, and second, to reflect on how can I be part of this, and what is the small role that I could play. And I think there are many, regardless of where you live. And then the other thing, particularly for a lot of, at the larger scale, I guess, for companies and governments that are making tree commitments, I wanted to send the message that I think this work is, yes, complex, but there's lots of lessons learned already. And there are, guardrails or general principles, I think, that can guide this work. And every project needs to be tailored to the local context and the local community, and supported by a local community. And yes, that's hard, but I think there are themes across them. And I also think that there are a lot of good companies and leaders working to make the effort of tree keeping better and to find the ways to make it economically viable. So there's my hope too.
And how do you maintain that on a kind of daily basis? How do you tap back into that when you're starting to feel a little bit discouraged or overwhelmed? Especially, and I don't, obviously we don't we don't need to get into politics right now. I've been spending a lot of time there, but right now is a time where a lot of people are struggling to find hope because they feel like the political will isn't there necessarily. So, how do you, as an individual who's really steeped in this content, what do you tell yourself in those moments where your hope is hard to catch?
I mean, I guess I think about, if you focus on what got us into the climate mess, it was the actions of many, many, many people, collective action. And certainly, some are more responsible than others, but we're playing a part. And so I guess I flip the coin and say the same is true in the solution space. What are the good things that I can do to contribute? Yes, I would like to spark more change at a larger scale, but I also believe I can make a difference at a small scale. And hopefully, potentially, let's all put our, cross our fingers that will have an impact too, in due course, in due time.
I love it, and it's so true. Sometimes when we are feeling like our hands are most tied behind our back, or we're feeling like the most like a very tiny, tiny cog in like increasingly feeling like an authoritarian wheel, the ability to to be empowered to make these kind of small scale decisions, to support the leaders that we want to support, to engage in active change on our own personal property or within our communities, is it's not just a way to recapture that hope, but it's a way to feel like and not just to feel like, but to actually be doing something when it's hard to feel like we're affecting change against the background of what's happening politically right now.
Yeah, and I'd say also to address, this moment. I mean, I am a scientist who's worked on environmental issues. I work on climate. My husband is a, you know, doctor who works on infectious disease outbreaks and public health. Like, in a time when science is called into question like this, and so many people in fields I value and care about and believe are critical are laid off. I also think about like what can come from this period of disruption. Like, how do you not give up? How do those people come together? What's the pivot? And I don't think anyone has an answer to that, but I think that if you throw your hands up and say, well, we can't, then we can't. What will chart the path forward is people figuring out how to come together again differently.
And we will. I'm not just hopeful, but I'm confident that we will, because I think that is how the pendulum swings, is that sometimes we get comfortable and then we have to realize that we can't get too comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully, for those who are listening right now, they are curious and their appetite has been whetted to be able to pick up your book, Treekeepers, to read about the hope that is in front of us and the type of future that we can have on this planet with some planning, some decision making, and some real stewardship.
Yeah, and I think in a time when it feels like people are going different ways, I think, one of the lessons I took from the different people involved in tree keeping is that it also brings us together. So I look to the act of tree keeping for that too during these times.
I love that. Well, everybody, the book is Treekeepers: The Race for a Forested Future by Dr. Lauren E. Oakes. Lauren, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me. Good questions. It was a good conversation.
Yeah, it was so fun. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.